What did the man do? He's quite honestly most responsible of any individual in the United States of preserving more land than the other person in United States history.
Bob Marshall saved on his own millions of acres of wilderness. He understood the importance of wilderness in a way that not a whole lot of people necessarily understood, or not a whole lot of people who were in a position to do something about it understood.
Probably around Teddy Roosevelt's time, 1901, the recreation part of going into the wilderness is starting to catch on, and people are going into the mountains and they're seeing the devastation that's going on. The Adirondacks were part of that. When you went hiking up Marcy, they had logged all the way about a half a mile from the summit of Marcy. So you had to go through all this logged out area just to get there. So people came and they said, we have to do something about this. Well, for New York State, they were smart enough to realize that by cutting down the forest, you're losing a lot of the ability to retain water. So if you cut down the trees, the water just goes right through the soil and goes out, floods everything.
The Adirondack Park was founded in part to preserve water quality for New York City. One of the men involved in the founding of the Adirondack Park was Lewis Marshall, Bob Marshall's father.
Lewis Marshall was the person who put the words that became the phrase "forever wild" into the New York State Constitution. And he did that because he understood the value of the forest in terms of preserving water quality. That's why the Adirondack Park was created in the first place, the Adirondack Park and the Catskill Park, to preserve the watershed, because we need trees and we need protection to take care of precious water.
So New York City and places like that, they're really worried that they're not going to have water if everything is timbered in the Adirondacks as well as the Catskills. They were really worried that the canals, the Erie Canal, would drop because the amount of logs that were being cut down. So that really helped them to push the idea that wilderness has to be preserved.
Bob Marshall's father, Lewis Marshall, purchased what became known as Knollwood in 1900. It was just before Bob was born. New York City at the time, there's no air conditioning in the summer. Everybody who can wants to leave. So as soon as school ended, they would take the long train ride up to the Adirondacks.
And the reason why they bought that land is because they were Jewish, and when Louis and some of his Jewish friends tried to go to a hotel in the Adirondacks, they would not allow them in because they were Jewish.
It was the Grand Union Hotel. It was very she. And there was a very wealthy businessman, Joseph Seligman. He'd gone there for years with his family and had reservations, and he showed up and signed his name in, and the desk clerk looked at him and said, "I'm sorry, Hebrews are not allowed here." So Seligman, after that, decided it was time for him to purchase his own place. He did, and many other Jews who had the money or the wherewithal to do so also did. 5 other families, or perhaps 6, I'm not sure, were also involved in Knollwood. Those were, all were Jewish, all were escaping from discrimination.
Knollwood was a place for both George and Bob to really get to enjoy the Adirondacks. Bob and George, who loved to study things and read.
He, as a young boy, discovered a map in his family's cabin on Lower Saranac Lake, and the map was done by Verplanck Colvin, who was a famous surveyor and an illustrator and a writer, and somebody who cared a lot about the environment. And when Bob saw this map, he suddenly realized that there was real, actual, factual wilderness, and he could get there. He had always wanted to be an explorer like Lewis and Clark.
And they start thinking, what's beyond Saranac Lake. Because when they look out from Knollwood, they look across the lake, they can see Ampersand Mountain. They can see the mountains, the Sawtooth Range in the background there. And they realize that maybe there's something beyond what they see in front of there.
As early as the 1820s, some residents of the Adirondacks offered their services as guides for visitors. Typically, these guides would have knowledge of and experience in the surrounding wilderness. Guides would lead their clients into the woods on hiking, boating, and hunting trips. One of these guides was Herb Clark, who took Bob and George Marshall under his tutelage.
It was Herb who decided that maybe we should expand where we are, and the first idea was to go climb Ampersand in 1915. So he took the two kids, Bob is only 14 and George is only 12, and they take them up Ampersand, and they got to the top and they really loved Ampersand. As the years go by and the trips get bigger and longer, Bob and George want to take a bigger, longer trip. So they go do Whiteface in 1918.
He wanted to do that kind of exploring. He wanted to be in nature, and he understood the difference between urban life and real wilderness because he spent a lot of the time growing up, the school year, in Manhattan. And so when he got to the country, when he got to the Adirondacks, he was in love.
Going into the mountains with his brother George and Herb Clark, his guide, they traveled everywhere. Bob could walk 30 miles in a heartbeat, 40 miles in a heartbeat, and he was such incredible physical shape that he would go and see all these beautiful places. It's amazing the amount of places that he visited just in the Adirondacks, all these different trips, because he wanted to see it. He wanted to experience the wilderness.
Driven by their love of nature and exploration, Bob and George Marshall committed themselves to climbing all of the mountains within the Adirondack Park that were more than 4,000 feet above sea level.
The idea was they looked at a map. Bob and George both looked and saw that there were mountains. There were 42 mountains over 4,000 feet. So they determined to climb those first. When they climbed the first 42, Bob went back and wrote about it and said how beautiful these mountains are. It was called the High Peaks of the Adirondacks. And one of the guys that read it was a guy named Russell M.L. Carson. He thought it was so exciting that from that point on, he started climbing more and more. And he thought the history of these mountains would really be important. So in 1927, 5 years after Bob wrote High Peaks of the Adirondacks, he comes out with a book called People and Peaks of the Adirondacks. And with that, people really start going out there and climbing it. Russell Carson becomes really good friends of both Bob and George. And he says, hey, I looked at the map. Why don't you climb these three other mountains that are at 4,000 feet exactly? But also Gray, you didn't climb Gray, but it seems to be far enough away from Marcy. They had a criteria of it had to be 200 feet in elevation or a quarter of a mile away. So they said, why don't you climb these? And Bob and George both go, okay, all right, we'll climb those. So they added those for him.
On June 10th, 1925, Bob Marshall, George Marshall, and Herb Clark became the first documented humans to climb all 46 high peaks in the Adirondacks. Since then, over 10,000 men and women have followed in their footsteps. These climbers are known as 46ers, many of whom share Bob and George's love of wilderness and environmental conservation.
As he would climb mountains or have different adventures, he saw things changing. He wrote about going to the top of Graves Mountain, which was one of his favorite climbs. And when he got to that mountaintop and was expecting pristine environment, instead he saw smoke, and he wondered what was making the smoke, and he looked closer and he saw that there was a train. And he said, the wilderness is being changed. It was no longer the same. It made him very, very sad, and he knew he had to do something.
And because of his experience here, That really helped him in the future.
In 1925, Bob Marshall began his career as a forester with the U.S. Forestry Service. At that time, the Forestry Service was primarily focused on efficient timber harvesting.
How can you get the most timber out of the woods that the United States owns? When Bob gets there, he's lucky. He's very lucky. Bob had the luck of coming into the Forest Service or becoming a management in the Forest Service when the Depression hits. Depression starts in October of 1929. The people get rid of Herbert Hoover. And who do they put in? They put in Delaware Roosevelt. He's a liberal Democrat. One of the first things he does is contact a guy named Gifford Pinchot, who is the father of the Forest Service. So here's the President of the United States saying, we need to preserve some of our wilderness and some of the forests. What does Pinchot do? He contacts Bob Marshall, because Bob Marshall at this point is starting to write things. He's becoming really well known, and he offers him a job.
Once at the Forestry Service, Bob Marshall quickly rose up the ranks, eventually becoming the head of recreation management in the Forest Service. Under Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration, Bob oversaw the preservation of millions of acres of federal land.
He got the importance of wilderness at a time when maybe not a whole lot of people did, or maybe at a time when the Industrial Revolution, which had already happened, but there were cars and trucks, and Henry Ford had come out with his Model T. And once they had the Model T, well, you can't sell cars if you don't have roads. Ford wants to sell cars, and Bob Marshall wants to keep the wilderness wilderness. So it was a race against time. He thought, I have to save this before the wilderness is destroyed forever by a highway.
And what Bob did, more than anything, what he did was start the Wilderness Society in 1935. In 1935, he got together with 4 other guys and decided that they needed a national organization that would look at wilderness and preserve it. This is probably more of his legacy than anything else. Started the Wilderness Society. Now, his father dies in 1929. His father leaves each one of the kids over $1 million. Bob doesn't have to work the rest of his life if he didn't want to. But he knew that preserving the wilderness was really, really important. So he funds things like the Wilderness Society. I think this is my opinion, I think he was married to the wilderness thing because he put every ounce of energy into it, trying to preserve as much wilderness as he could.
Since its founding, the Wilderness Society has helped pass conservation laws to preserve public land. It has also purchased lands for preservation, contributing a total of 109 million acres, most notably the Bob Marshall Wilderness in Montana.
Bob Marshall set up the Wilderness Society because he realized that somebody needed to speak out for the wilderness, somebody needed to legislate for the wilderness, and he couldn't do it on his own. There needed to be a private organization that did it. He understood the importance and really wanted to make wilderness available to everybody.
Sadly, Bob Marshall died unexpectedly at the age of 38.
He was found dead on a train. He was on a trip to see his nieces and nephews, who he adored. He may have had a heart condition. I don't know what it was. He was certainly a very active and very physical guy. He walked 30 miles a day, maybe 40 miles a day.
When Bob dies in 1939, the Wilderness Society doesn't know what they're going to do. Bob isn't the president, but he's really their leader and really helps direct it. Though don't get me wrong, the 4 other guys that are on this, that started this, are really instrumental in trying to save our wilderness. But after Bob dies, they continue on. In 1964, because of the Wilderness Society, they set aside 9 million acres, President Johnson does, because of the Wilderness Society really is instrumental in preserving these lands. So Bob's legacy is more in the Wilderness Society more than anything else.
So much of what Bob Marshall was about speaks to my heart. I'm a person who needs wilderness. I'm a person who needs the solace of just an open space where there's no noise or human interaction. It should not be a privilege to have a special place like that. It should be something that every human being can go to and refresh their soul.
There is no bigger environmentalist conservationist than Bob Marshall. He alone helped save millions and millions of acres that probably would have gotten destroyed.